today we're supposed to review.
Oh, so he just absolutely hates the ITV, so it's just a good excuse to do it.
I don't know, I can teach it all the time. Alright. Well, we're starting semester 2. And this is mostly about, I like to call it organismal biology, basically. We'll like kind of wrap up evolution here. Talk about the tree of life, so we'll talk about all like the big groups of animals. You'll dissect the big group of animals, and you'll have like at least 10 different dissections. So a lot of hands-on labs. Then we'll talk about plants, unit on ecology, and then the last unit is the human body system. And it's kind of like you get to teach the class. So you'll be designated a chapter, you're the instructor, you make the PowerPoint, you lecture, you come up with the homework, you come up with questions. But I'll give you, like when we get closer, I'll for sure give you at least a month to start working on it. I mean, like, no one really starts working on it until the day before, but we always procrastinate, so it's whatever.
Sounds about right.
However you want to do your stress level, right? Okay. So chapter 23 is about systematics. And so we're going to talk about how animals are grouped, how animals are named, and then we'll end the lecture talking about cladograms, and then I do have a cladogram assignment for you. So evolutionary biology is both about the process and the history of it. We've looked at natural selection in chapter 22 and other processes that can change the allele population. We did some labs, to kind of look at how allele frequencies changed. We also talked about how different processes can lead to the origin of new species, so like genetic flow, or gene flow, I should say, reproductive barriers. But evolutionary biology, what it's really trying to do is reconstruct the history of life on Earth. And so some key terms here, we're basically tracing phylogeny. Phylon means tribe.
Told you he was going to do it.
And genesis means origin. So the evolutionary history of a species or a group of related species. To reconstruct the phylogeny, we call it systematics. So we'll look at characteristics, what characteristics are common in animals, because the whole purpose, or the whole idea is they have something in common, then most likely derived from a common ancestor. So naming a grouping of organisms, this is going to be review of Life Science 7 with nomenclature, how animals are named with a two-name system called binomial system. You have a species name and then, a genus name and then a species name. This was invented by Carl von Linné, or also known as Carolus Linnaeus, father of taxonomy, Swedish naturalist who started to give scientific names to animals. So we have the genus is the first name and then the species. So we are Homo sapiens. Dogs are Canis familiaris. Polar bears are Ursus. All bears are Ursus, but then polar bear is Maritimus. Okay, so as more organisms were classified, he decided to kind of build this hierarchical plan of classifications based on orders, classes, and kingdoms. So you may have remembered like King Philip came over for grape soda, or King's play chess on fuzzy green stools.
Is that the kingdom phylum?
Yep. So kingdom, phylum, order, came over for family, genus, species. And then above that is the domain. You okay?
Me and Ruben made
a mnemonic device.
Yeah.
What was it?
Well, I can't say, but
it's bad.
Wow.
It's inappropriate.
Only one word is bad.
Is it an F word?
But if we no. It's just messed up. But we made it so messed. That's what we always do. We make it so messed up, so we always remember it.
It was like 2 years.
We made it like 3 years ago, and we still just.
I'll just say it, bro.
Can't afford it.
Yeah.
I can't.
Okay. All right. The classes of animals have changed over time. So when Linnaeus, when he started the group, he had quadrupeds, like four-limbed animals, birds, amphibians, fishes, insects, worms. But now today, we kind of like switch them together. Mammals, aves, that's birds, amphibians, and reptiles, and fishes. And then these guys actually have their own little subgroup. But does anyone know why nomenclature is important?
So you can tell who can reproduce with who.
Okay, so you can figure out which species is which species. You guys ever... So if I say daddy long legs, what do you think of?
Long legs.
Spiders. you're in the UK and you're talking about daddy longlegs, you want to know what they think you're thinking or talking about?
What?
Mosquitoes.
Really?
Yep. Yeah, so it's to establish communications like everyone's on the same page. That's why nomenclature is important. Because common terms, they mean something else in different parts of the world. So, systematics, what we're trying to do is unite all forms of life on Earth. We know that our fossil record is not perfect, but if it was, we'd be able to trace this evolutionary history and make our lives a lot easier. But that's not the case. So we have to rely on evidence to establish the best hypothesis for these evolutionary relationships. And I do want to say that these evolutionary relationships can change if new fossils or new information is found. So these are mostly hypotheses. Like I said, though, they can be disproven for more accurate scientific ideas. Systematics is the reconstruction and study of evolutionary relationships. We're going to look at similarities as well as differences in species. And using these characteristics, we should be able to construct a type of evolutionary tree, that's the phylogeny, that represents this hypothesis of how things are passed on from one species to another. So we use branching diagrams. Darwin, in his diary, was kind of the first person to kind of show this branching diagram. Kind of looked like a tree. The process of descent with modifications, a term that Darwin never used, just so you know, from common ancestry results in all species being related to this branching. So like, here we have this common ancestor, and all of a sudden it branches out into 3 different species, and then these can subdivide and branch out. Sometimes, however, similarity doesn't really accurately predict their relationship. Oops.
Like a bat and a bird.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Early systematics reasoned that the time since 2 species diverged from the common ancestor means that they will be more different. So I should have left my little diagram up there. So we had this, and then I'm just going to do this. Okay. So like this has diverged twice, so this should be more different than that. But that's not necessarily true. We know that evolution can be rapid, could be oscillating back and forth. It's not always constant. Left jaw versus right jaw. Black moths versus white moths. It's not always divergent. We talked a little bit about convergence, where 2 species independently evolve the same features due to maybe similar habitats they live in and similar adaptations that allow them to thrive in those habitats. But how to read a phylogeny tree? You just look at it. No, I'm just kidding.
Yes.
Okay. It takes practice to interpret them correctly, just so you know. But it does look at characteristics. And the next slide.
Can I have attention, please? Tomorrow's lunch will be
We need to ban announcements for today.
That's it. I'm calling Aaron.
I think they're just being mean.
That's it.
We're not. We can't.
You're being so cruel with these announcements. Everyone's thinking we're getting out. Just wanted to let you know. All right, have a good one. Yeah, me too. If I could. Yeah, bye.
Dumble's a weatherman. He told me there's a chance at 1.
Who?
That's what Dumble said.
Oh, whatever. You don't know.
Okay. So it does consist of branches, which is pretty self-explanatory. Nodes, where they branch off. And then tips. The tips can be either living or extinct, but they're the most commonly recent species. So A split off to B and I, B split off to C and F. These are the species. So the fundamental idea is that closely related species should share some of the same characteristics. So like J and K split off from I. These 2 are more similar to each other than to D and E. Okay, because it's more distance away from it. Okay. So the endpoints, we call them taxons or groups of animals. We discussed the biological species concept. Species are groups of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from such other groups. They can only reproduce with their own species, but we know that's not the case. Remember, the biological species concept is not perfect. But the gray wolf, it belongs to the class Mammalia, the order Carnivoria. What do you guys think that means? Carnivore. Family Canidae, it's kind of breaking it down into dogs. So Canis Lupus for gray wolf, or Canis Lupus. There's actually an organization out there that is responsible for nomenclature of animals. It's the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature, and they do meet every year and discuss like new species that have been discovered and refine some of the names to clarify any questions. So. Above the kingdom, you have domains, and that's something that I wish they would just include in the mnemonic device. So the King Philip came over for grape soda. Really, it should be D before the kingdom.
Oh, we have that.
You have the D?
Oh yeah.
Nice.
Say it, Matt. Just do it.
There are 3 domains, bacteria, archaea, and then eukarya. And then underneath eukarya, you have several kingdoms like Kingdom Plantae, Kingdom Animalia, and a few others.
Does order come before family?
King Philip came over, yes. 4. Got it?
Yeah.
Okay. To describe the taxa between each other, you can describe them as monophyletic, paraphyletic, and polyphyletic. So I should probably warn you that in this chapter there's a lot of vocab words. So monophyletic means it's a single tribe or a clade. And I'll show you on the next slide what that looks like. Paraphyletic means the group includes most recent common ancestor, but excludes some of the descendants. And then polyphyletic means that they don't share really a common ancestor. There's 2 or more ancestral lineages. So, oops, I should have. So monophyletic is in green. So this could be considered monophyletic. You could also, there's lots of ways to draw monophyletic. You could do this, or you could do this, or you could do this, or you could have done this. Okay, but there's more than one way.
Could you circle just the whole thing? And then-
Yes, you could circle the whole thing. Okay, the next word in, I think it was in orange, paraphyletic, includes most recent ancestor, but includes some of the descendants. So this is paraphyletic. Okay, what's another way I could have drawn paraphyletic?
To the left.
To the left, so I could have just done this. And left those 2 out. Okay, and then polyphyletic means it has, there's no common ancestor, there's 2 more ancestral lineages. So here, like if you included that, now it's no longer para, it's mono. But these are.
Could you have drawn that one with the B and the I?
Like this.
Yeah, like from below the B and then everything except the A.
Yeah, you could do that, yes. Yep, everything except the A, yep. So, again, more than one ways. You'll see these terms pop up again, so just make sure you, I don't know, put a star by this or write it on a piece of paper so you know, but there's just a lot of vocab terms here. Okay, so there's 2 ways to quantify the degree of similarity. The phonetic approach is looking at DNA sequences, which we can't do because we're veterinary schools, right?
Oh.
Cladistic approach, however, means that you can look at shared derived characters or synapomorphies. So here's another term that you're going to see a lot. Synapomorphies. Shared derived characters or shared derived traits. So you look at all the traits at a table, you put like pluses for those that have them, zeros if they don't, and then from that information you can construct a phylogenetic tree. The logic is elegant, but there are problems due to convergent evolution. And I just, again, put the definition of convergent evolution. 2 species are similar, not because they were present in a common ancestor, but they just have similar traits due to similar habitats. But they had evolved those traits independently. So like poison dart frogs and poison frogs in South America and Africa. 2 different species, same habitats, but came up with their own similar defense mechanisms. Okay. So what I mean by shared derived characters, derived means that it was inherited and it came from a recent common ancestor. Ancestral means similarity arose prior to the common ancestor. So you can identify characters as either ancestral or derived. So an example of ancestral and derived. Hair is a derived feature of mammals. Lungs is an ancestral feature because lungs can be found in amphibians and reptiles. Does that make sense? Okay, so like when we talk about the evolution of life, we're going to start with like life in the water. So we'll talk about fish and how jaws developed. And then we'll talk about amphibians because they're quasi. They can live in the water for part of their life and then they transition to land. And then we'll talk about the reptiles and how the reptiles transitioned to birds. And then birds.
What was the first animals? Fish.
Most likely.
And
That's the
amphibians,
hypothesis.
and then reptiles.
And like I'll show you characteristics of that, like tadpoles, they have like tiny little gills before their lungs develop. Amphibians have a 3-chambered heart. Reptiles have a 4-chambered heart. Cold-blooded to warm-blooded. Yeah. So how do you determine ancestral versus derived? You have to polarize. You have to state whether they're ancestral or derived. You have to have an outgroup comparison. A taxon that doesn't fit with everything else, but you still consider it kind of close within the other groups being studied. So we're going to actually do an example together. So here's my table, and I'm just looking at simple animals here like fish, reptile, monkey, apes, humans. And 0 denotes trait absence, 1 denotes trait presence. And so these are the characters I'm looking at. Character number was at the top, descriptions at the bottom. So denotes trait absence, denotes trait presence. So just I'm going to restate that again because every time I do this table, there's always a little bit of confusion when we get down here. Okay, character number 1, organism has 4 legs. So do I put a 0 or a 1? 0. Organism has fur.
0.
Organism has no tail.
0.
Organism.
That means it does have a tail.
Right. Yeah, that's where people get tripped up. Organism walks with bipedal locomotion.
Is the tail
0.
like their fin? The tail is like their fin or what?
They have
Like the
tails.
back.
The back, fin.
The caudal fin.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's their. Yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. Yep.
Wait. It denotes trait absence, so that means it does have it.
Right.
And then denotes trait.
Because it says
presence.
no tail, so it's a double negative.
Oh.
Yeah, that's where everyone kind of trips up. They're like, what? Okay. Reptile. Okay. Organism has 4 legs. Yeah, they do. Fur
No way.
has no tail.
They have a tail.
They have a tail, so it's organism walks with bipedal locomotion. 2 legs. 2 legs.
No way.
No.
Oh no.
Okay, moving on to the monkey. 4 legs. Well, limbs. We'll say limbs. I mean, legs and limbs. Has fur. Has no tail.
What has a tail?
Has a tail.
Big time.
Walks with bipedal locomotion.
Yep.
Yeah, they can, can't they?
Well, they can't.
No. I mean, that's not how they primarily move. Okay. Apes. 4 legs.
Yeah.
4 limbs. Yeah. Fur. Has no tail. Anyone?
No, they don't have.
They don't have a tail. Okay. So this is a 1. Organism walks with bipedal locomotion.
Yeah.
They can, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, give or take.
They're just using their knuckles.
Oh yeah, they. Yeah.
All right. Human.
1.
Has fur. Do we have hair?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
No tail. So we lost our tail. Walk with bipedal locomotion. Okay. Now I set this up so you can kind of see. I mean, it's really nice. On your assignment today, you'll be given these like made up traits of extinct dinosaurs, and it may not look this nice, but you can see this is a nice stepwise table here. So this is Okay. So now we have to construct a cladogram. I think I'm going to leave this up here. So we had fish, and it was reptile, monkey, ape, and then human, right? So which animal is my outlier? Fish. So that fish would go here. Okay, because it didn't share any characteristics with any of those. Okay, so then I had a trait that evolved that all the other organisms share. What trait was that?
The 4 legs.
Yep. Was it the 4 limbs? Okay. So this trait evolved, and now I have reptile. Okay, what was this trait?
Fur.
Was it?
Yeah.
Okay. That's fur, and then I put monkey here.
And no tail.
No tail. Ape. And then bipedal locomotion. Human. And I'll erase all this. Well, I didn't mean to erase that, but I did. Okay, so we just made a cladogram based on derived and shared characteristics. It's stepwise. It's my outgroup. 4 limbs. All of these have 4 limbs. But the reptile doesn't have fur, still has his tail, and doesn't do bipedal locomotion. So this table tells you some information about what these organisms are like. So very simple cladogram. Again, we were just looking at characteristics, very simple characteristics. 0 is our plasiomorphic condition. 1 is apomorphic. So plasio means original ancestral states. Apomorphic means they change, they're derived, they're more advanced. So, yeah. Okay, this slide is more vocab. And there is a YouTube link here. I think I put it in the notes. That goes over apomorphic and synapomorphic and symplasiomorphic and plasiomorphic. Because on your assignment, at the last page, I have plasiomorphic, symplasiomorphic, apomorphic, and synapomorphic. So I have a sentence, and you're supposed to describe what is it describing? Is it plasiomorphic or symplasiomorphic? All that. But you basically just did a cladistic classification. You made a family tree based on characters or traits. There are 3 assumptions with cladistics. Plasiomorphic characteristics, that means that they're original or ancestral. It's primitive. However, there's a sub-vocab word underneath plasiomorphic for symplasiomorphic. It means that they're shared by a common group of organisms. Apomorphic is derived advanced state, but it can be changed, shared by 2 or more taxa. So they all, to me, look the same, but there really is a difference. Other assumptions: any group of organism is related by descent from a common ancestor. And the tree of life, I mean, what was the first organism like? Everyone kind of derived from that. So we do have lots of hypotheses of how that occurred. The way things branch can be different. So in our example, we did this, like a nice little stepwise, but they can branch out like this, and this means this is lineage splitting, where all these changes pretty much occurred at once, where this was stepwise and
One got 4 legs, one got 2, and one got 3.
yeah, something like that. So there's lots of different branching patterns out there. The whole purpose of cladistics analysis is just to shed some light on evolutionary relationships between groups. I already talked about this several slides ago. Nodes are the branching points. It's generated every time a derived character is identified. You can have sister groups, 2 groups on alternate sides of a node. So on ours we had apes, and then it branched off into humans, whatever. So you can consider this a sister group because they're sharing a node and they're right next to each other. So. There are some factors, again, that can complicate Cladistics, so convergent evolution is a big one, due to homeoplasy. Share character state that has not been inherited from a common ancestor. Birds and insect wings, they can both fly, but the structure of their wings is completely different. Reversals, sometimes traits go back to their ancestral feature. We can also call it homeoplasy. We have an incomplete fossil record, so there's just gaps. The thing about cladistics you need to keep in mind, the principle of parsimony. Always look for the simplest explanation, nice stepwise formation of how that came to be. Always. Like the less branches, the more, I guess, the less branches, how do I want to say this? Like the less branches means the less evolutionary changes. Like it's more likely to happen that way. So simplest branches. So a case study looking at whale evolution from a cladistic approach. If you look at whales and a group of animals called arteriodactyls, which include cows, deer, and hippos, they have hooves and even number of toes. Okay, they have this unusual pulley-shaped ankle bone called the astrolagus. It's a shared and derived character that identifies arteriodactyls. So if you have the astrolagus, you are considered arteriodactyl. So here's some even-toed ungulates, if you will.
You said whales connected to them?
So whales are kind of this outgroup. Like this was the original cladogram. Gain of pulley-shaped astrolagus, and then camel, and pig, and hippo, and deer, and cow derived from it. So they believe that it was a synapomorphy that identified the arteriodactyls. So this is our monophyletic group here, and whales were served as our outlier or our outgroup. However, we looked at DNA comparisons between all of these species, and they noticed that whales share many similarities with hippos. So our cladogram isn't really accurate. Conflicted with the morphological data, because they couldn't find the pulley-shaped astrolagus in previous fossils. The conflict inspired the hypothesis that both whales and dolphins are descended from populations of arteriodactyls that spent most of their time feeding in shallow waters, as where hippos are today. In 2001, so almost 20 years ago, they discovered the fossil arteriodactyls, and they were clearly related to whales and yet had a pulley-shaped astrolagus. So this is what the new cladogram looks like today. Gain of pulley-shaped bone, okay, the astrolagus, here. But then because whales shared so many similarities with hippos in their DNA sequences, the whales lost that pulley-shaped bone. So now this is where they're at. Now the first cladogram I showed you of this was parsimonious. This is the least way to show the data that you've been given. It's not considered the most parsimonious, but due to the data, DNA comparisons, this is the best way to show that.
How come then like hippos like eat like they like attack people and like they could eat like or like meat maybe and whales don't really?
Never read Moby Dick?
Wow. Other than that, like,
Yeah, but hippos don't, that's not their main purpose. They don't, oh, there's a
Yeah.
human, I'm going to go get them.
ravages.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay, keep in mind, cladistic analysis can be objective. Still no better than a researcher who decides what characters are important to use in analysis, like what characters should you use making your cladogram. So yeah, there's some objective with it. Again, you have to look at the fossil record of what you have. They provide information concerning probable relationships. You can sequence, shared derived characters, but they're doing the best they can, trying to map out the tree of life. Holy moly. I don't think we're going to get to the assignment today. I'll have to give you a work day tomorrow. Lucky you guys. Okay, the last section today is systematics and classification. So feel like I've just said this before, but reconstruction and study of evolutionary relationships. How do we group species into groups? It's not always congruent. I just mentioned these three vocab terms. Monophyletic means it includes that common ancestor. Paraphyletic means that it includes a common ancestor, but it doesn't include like the other side of the tree. And then polyphyletic means they don't share a common ancestor. So we talked about the biological species concept. Well, there's also a phylogenetic species concept, which means that species should be applied to groups of population that have been evolving independently of other groups of population. So it's just basically another definition of what a species is. So
On that last slide, it said
Yeah.
polyphyletic.
uh-huh.
But in that picture we showed, weren't they sharing the same one?
No, it was like this. But you only like circled that.
Yeah. So it just doesn't count those down.
Yeah, it just like disregards that.
Okay.
It's where you box. I mean,
Okay.
a cladogram can show all three. Just depends on where you're focusing it on. Two problems with phylogenetic species concept. Biological species concept cannot be applied to allopatric populations. Remember what allopatric means? They're apart. Okay, so they're apart, and all of a sudden, if they were to come together, what would happen? You can't look at that. And then phylogenetic species concept can be applied to both sexual and asexual. This is good. This kind of expands our species a little bit because biological species was only looking at sexual forms, those that reproduced sexually, and we know that there are organisms out there that reproduce asexually. So this kind of covers that. So some drawbacks, however, can lead to recognition of every slightly differentiated population as a distinct species. There are glades in Missouri and this type of lizard, and like this, some people organize this lizard, or this, I think it's a salamander actually, as one species, but they have like just different little populations, different colorations, different niches, if you will. So this would like categorize them as a whole bunch of different species. Species may not always be monophyletic, so it becomes isolated, and they would basically be qualified as a species. So, okay, I'm going to hand out the assignment. You can look at it, and I'll talk about it.
I don't know why I thought about this just now, actually, because it was an unknowledgeable question. Right. What was the way back at the beginning of the year? The one where the meteorite brought the life to Earth. Oh, was that like the
spermagenesis.
Okay.